if you're joining me this evening, get you a robe on, comfy blanket, grab you a drink, settle in. We're going to discuss some haunted history. So the place that we're going to be discussing today is called Hales Bar Dam. Now, unless you're outside of the deep paranormal world, you probably haven't heard of this place. It was featured on Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters, but it's in a small town. It's in Marion County, Tennessee. People there know it, but if you're really outside of this area, probably haven't heard of Hales Bar. So let's take a deep dive into this history. It goes back to the time of the Native Americans in the early settlements. We're talking prior 1900s. We're going a couple hundred years back. So this area was home to a whirlpool that the Native Americans, Cherokees, called the Suck. This is an area that they held as sacred because they believed that their ancestors, people in their tribes that passed away, their souls went into that whirlpool. So it was something that was held sacred to them. And Chief Dragging Canoe, which was a war chief for the Cherokees, actually ended up cursing the land when settlements started coming through, saying that any settlements there would not prosper. So that plays a large role in what now is going through on paranormal activity. Anyone that has ghost hunted or knows anything about paranormal knows you do not mess with those Native American spirits. Those are something else. So we're already starting out on a rough foot for Hales Bar Dam with having that curse. The construction on the dam itself started in 1905, but they ran into a host of problems. Going back to that curse, it's showing its head here. They ran into any and every problem you can imagine. It was supposed to be finished in 1909. It didn't actually finish until 1913. So it took them 8 years to complete a dam that was supposed to be done in 4. Tons and tons of problems. Even after it was finished construction, it had continuous leaks and cracks. This was a problem for years, and it actually caused a lot of the deaths that occurred on this property. A couple of the more tragic ones is once it was finished construction, there was a tunnel underneath it. That tunnel is unfortunately where a lot of townspeople and school children had to go to get to school, to get to town. When a couple of school children went into the tunnel that ran underneath the dam, a leak busted. And these were not small leaks that busted through. These were pretty substantial. It was holding back a lot of water. So when that leak busted, it killed the kids on impact, unfortunately. So that goes into some of the hauntings that is going on now. There is reports of children's spirits, and it is believed to be the 2 children that were killed by one of the leaks in the tunnel. Now, hundreds of workers died on construction of this thing, through leaks, what have you. Tons and tons of workers had died there, unfortunately, which is just adding more fuel to the fire and going back to the Native American curse of not having a prosperous area, a prosperous land. Nothing in that land is supposed to bode well at all, and it definitely is not. A few more of the more notable deaths that happened there is in regards to a boiler explosion that occurred in Hales Bar Dam. That had multiple fatalities. Another instance that occurred was workers got into a skirmish, and one of the workers shot the other worker. This occurred in 1906. So this was with the first construction of the dam. Another instance, 2 African American workers were unfortunately murdered by 2 white workers. This was racially charged, and the white workers were never prosecuted. So it is believed that those African American workers are possibly some of the spirits that we are seeing now. Obviously not having their murders persecuted, that's just terrible. Tons of unfinished business there, so it is very likely. There was another murder of a worker in 1912, and of course all of the other hundreds of workers that passed away just by accidents of the workplace, not through murder or anything like that. Just so much death is surrounding this place, and unfortunately several murders and the passing away of children. It all combined with the Native American curse is just, this place is a hotbed for activity. Now, I mentioned before that a lot of this took place during the first construction that started in 1905 of the dam. So, like I mentioned before, tons of issues, tons of leaks and cracks. They were actually putting corsets and mattresses, like on a bed, up against these leaks, trying to hold the water back. So eventually the state of Tennessee was like, yeah, this thing needs to be fixed. It's gonna kill everybody. So in 1964, they started construction again, which of course led to more deaths from workers because the working conditions were deplorable. Eventually the state of Tennessee determined that with the bottom areas of the dam and where the tunnel was, people dying, the children dying, it just wasn't worth it to try to keep repairing the leaks anymore. It was not sound, and they just weren't able to sink any more money to something that just kept breaking and kept leaking and causing all of these deaths of civilians and workers. So they decided to flood the entire bottom levels of this dam, including the top where the workers and children passed away most frequently. Now, what this did was flood the entire town below. You heard that right, the entire town below. Now, of course, they allowed people to evacuate and get their belongings and everything, so it's just buildings, but they flooded the cemetery and did not move the bodies. Now, this, of course, can definitely cause restless spirits. You're disturbing their resting place. They're now underwater. Their gravestones, through currents and boats, are getting moved. Their headstones are no longer with their bodies, more than likely. It's just that was a terrible move on the state's part. Now, I know digging up a body and moving that is also controversial, but I don't know. Flooding the cemeteries, just to me, is not a good move. Not a good move. Now today, Hales Bar Dam is a marina. So only the top 2 stories of what the original Hales Bar Dam is even visible anymore. The rest was completely flooded. So you're only able to have access to those top 2. There is a dry storage area, and they even have floating cabins on the areas where the town used to be that you can rent for vacation. So if getting a floating cabin on top of bodies in the water is something that you're into, you can do that at Hales Bar Dam. And on my next vacation. Now let's get into some of the paranormal activity. So some of the reports, both from local investigators, just normal visitors, and some things that ghost adventurers and ghost hunters all experienced, was native flutes, going back to that curse, and chanting. Those 2 things are relatively prevalent there. There is reports of demonic forces and a very large shadow person that can be seen both in the dry storage areas and through the top 2 stories that are still able to be walked through. A male apparition has appeared to visitors. He has not been identified as any particular worker, but he is pretty commonly seen. There's also been shadows that have been caught moving across the catwalks and the ledges, and circling back to that demonic force. He is also pretty regularly seen in the tunnels, which to me is probably the most terrifying thing that I can imagine there. There's also reports of metal banging, which would be pretty common considering the workers there. That's something they would be doing every day. Not 100% sure that that is a conscious, active ghost. I feel like the metal banging would probably be more like residual energy. But that is something that is very commonly reported there, as well as screams, which once again, probably something to do with residual energy. Like I mentioned earlier, that boiler explosion, that definitely could have left an impact enough to have that residual energy, having those screams coming through from those tragic events, the shootings, the leaks, and the accidents. The screaming and metal banging is, in my opinion, 100% residual. But that demonic force, the shadow people, the apparitions, fortunately the children, spirits that have been seen there as well, I believe that is all conscious, active activity of spirits trying to communicate there. There have been reports of satanic rituals down in the tunnels, which is what sparked the demonic force. There are a lot of people in the paranormal world that go to Hales Bar because of the copious amounts of tragic death that occurred there, as well as the flooding of the town and the flooding of the cemeteries. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of people connected to this place that have passed. And there aren't that many places that there is a building or a structure outside of like hospitals that are connected to that much death, and especially that much tragic death. Thank you for joining me tonight to discuss Hales Bar Dam and discussing the history and the paranormal activity surrounding that place. It is not too terribly far from me, so I was definitely excited to make this my first video. If you have any recommendations for any other paranormal spots that I should research and do in my next videos, leave a comment below. Thank you for joining me tonight. Finish those drinks. Have a good evening.